It's good to see everybody here. We're glad that you are a part of our Sunday morning Bible class. If you will, open your Bibles to the book of James chapter 4, and we'll meet you there in just a moment. I'm reminded of a story about a preacher who he came into Bible class and he said, you know, the apostles were called to heal the sick and raise the dead and cast out the devil. But he got sort of mixed up, and he said the apostles were called to heal the dead, cast out the sick, and raise the devil. So, anyway, it's all about order, you know, the proper order that we put things. And James is a book that helps me to put things in their proper order and perspective. And it's not always easy to do. You think about what they're going through in the first century and how hard it is for them, especially in chapter 1 when you read about how they're scattered abroad. There's a lot of tough things going on. So he said, look, here's how we keep things going forward. And that's what this book is all about. As you can see, a faith that works. Okay? Chapter 1 is all about religion. Chapter 2 is about respect. We respect God. We respect our fellow man. Chapter 3, there's several responsibilities mentioned there. And then chapter 4, we talk about things that we are to resist. Okay, so we noticed some of this last Sunday morning. Let's pick up again in James chapter 4, and we'll begin in verse 1, and we'll work our way down. And we'll go from there. All right, will somebody read verses 1 and 2? Okay, so there's a lot of issues going on there. And he said, first of all, we need to resist strife. Okay, that's not always easy to do in hard time. But at any rate, that's what he's talking about here in the beginning of this chapter. Okay, so resist strife, we resist our surroundings, we resist Satan, and we resist a schedule. Now, I'm going to get to those last two parts today, and I hope to finish this chapter by the end of the class period today. All right, but notice, he said, you covet and cannot obtain, and you fight and quarrel. You have not because you what? Because you ask not. You know, when my teacher was teaching this class, he said, it's like a man who wonders why he's not married yet, but he hadn't asked his girlfriend to get married. You know, sometimes we don't have the things that we want just because we haven't said, Lord, this is something that I need for you to provide. It's not always easy to do, to put our trust in God, but I guess many times that's what we need to do. Somebody said, 7 days without prayer makes 1 week. But they didn't spell week W-E-E-K. They spelled it W-E-A-K. You know, I've come to a recent realization that prayer is very, very important. And I mean, it's real important. It's something that I need to be involved in all the time. You know, the Bible says, pray without ceasing. Particularly in times like this, in the book of James, when things get tough, when you feel like you're going to lose your mind sometimes, we need to just get on our knees. Well, I sort of think that's sort of a healer to a lot of situations of life. And he said, if we want to heal strife, we need to ask God. Ask God to heal the strife that's going on. All right, so that's sort of the first part. Now, the second part, we've already discussed all that, and we'll pick up where we left off. Yes, sir. I would say that he's speaking to, like, Jewish people, the 12 tribes, chapter 1, that are scattered abroad, but you may have something else in mind there. What do you think? Okay, yeah, sure. And I think it's definitely something for all of us to sort of remember. You know, we are the church. I guess that's the point you're wanting to make there, right? Yeah, we're definitely the church. And strife in the church is not a good thing. And anyway, I don't want to be the person ever to be the source of any kind of strife. And I hope that all of us feel the same way. So I think that's a good point. All right, anything else somebody wants to add to that? All right, let's look here in verses 3 and 4. He said, "You ask not and do not receive because you ask wrongfully that you may spend it upon your passions." Now, I want to focus on this passions just for a moment because he says, number one, we need to resist strife. Number two, we need to resist our surroundings. Will somebody read verse 4?
You adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is hostility toward God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God.
Okay, so there's obviously some big problems going on. In fact, I think the King James says, "Adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that the friendship of the world is enmity with God?" So this friendship of the world is something that's pretty bad. I mean, this is something pretty serious. Well, the surroundings that we're surrounded by every day usually are not really that good, okay? Think about passages like Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 4, which says, "Marriage is honorable in all, and the marriage bed is undefiled, but whoremongers and adulterers God will judge." In our society, especially the television, it is motivated by what you're seeing on the screen. It's pretty much normal. In fact, if a couple were to get married and they were both virgins, that would almost be unheard of. It's just the way the world works. So as Christians, he's speaking to Christians, like Mark said, we've got to be careful in the world about wanting to be like the world, being influenced by what's on the television and by friends and co-workers and whoever else. All right, let's go back to chapter 1. In fact, we preached a sermon about this last week. James chapter 1 and verse 27, he also mentions the world there. "Pure religion and undefiled before God and the Father is this, to visit the fatherless and their widows in their affliction, and to keep himself unspotted from the world." So James, of course, mentions this idea over and over. All right, I want to look at a man who chose something different. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11. There was a minister in Florida, and he lived in South Florida, and he loved the weather there. He wasn't from Florida, so he was just having the time of his life, in later years. So anyway, somebody asked him about the weather there, and he said this: "It's so beautiful in the winter that heaven does not interest people, and it's so hot in the summer that hell does not scare them." Well, he was a joking type minister, but he's trying to make a point about sometimes if we get too comfortable in the surroundings, guess what happens on the inside? It begins to melt away. So then we think, well, what's happening? Well, James is giving a cure-all for tough situations, and that's one of them. All right, will somebody read Hebrews chapter 11? Let me see here. Verses 24 and 25, and then we'll move on. Okay. So, the best way then is to do away with the things of the world, try to turn our focus on things that are for the Lord. All right. Now I want to move on. Here's kind of where we left off last time. Let's move on down in James chapter 4. We resist strife, we resist surroundings, but then how do we resist Satan? Look here in verse 7 and 8. He said, "Submit yourselves therefore to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Be wretched and mourn and weep, and let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves, therefore, and he will exalt you." Now, I'm going to spend probably most of my time here this morning and before I move on to the latter part of the chapter. All right. It's interesting. He said, if we resist the devil, what will he do?
Flee from you.
He will flee from you. Okay, so it can happen if we want to put away the devil. Now, I've got several scriptures here, and I want us to go to Matthew chapter 5. Okay, let's go to Matthew chapter 5. Now, there was a key, and I'll give you a hint. It's in verse 10. What is a key to submitting to God and resisting the devil? Probably not something you would think. Say what now? No, yeah, it can involve that. Verse 10. Yeah, James chapter 4 and verse 10. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, to be humble. Yeah, I should have told you where I was at there. But yeah, we are going to Matthew chapter 5, but there was a key in James 4 to resisting the devil, and it is humility. The worst thing that I have seen, even in myself and in others, is when I feel like I'm not wrong. Because when I feel like I'm not wrong, then I feel like I don't need to repent. And I'll be honest with you, it's scary sometimes if you're not careful. You ever been around someone that's close to you that will never say that they're sorry? How does that affect your relationship? To me, it affects it in a very negative way because you can't ever get anywhere in any tough situation. You know, if you have a problem with that person and you go to them and they'll never say that they're sorry, there's no resolution. So usually it drags on and on and on and on. The same would be true in my relationship with God. God says if I want to resist the devil, number one, I've got to submit to him. That word submit in James chapter 4 and verse 7, when he said submit yourselves to God, it literally means to put yourself under. That's not always easy to do. But if I want to fix this, and I want to focus on not the strife, I want to focus on not my surroundings, I want to focus on not the devil, it starts, number one, with humility. Now, it's interesting that he mentions this because if you remember last Sunday when we talked about not focusing on strife, what's the number one cause of strife? Miss Donna told us. You remember? That's your answer for everything today, isn't it? No. Last week, I asked the question, I said, what's the selfishness? That's right. I said, what's the number one reason for strife? She said it right off, selfishness. And that was right. We noticed some Bible verses. That's what causes strife. So if we want to do away with all of that, he says in verse 10, here's what you got to do. I've got to put myself under and realize it's time to start fixing some things. You know, it's time to start, I'd say, chipping away at the block. You know, don't let the devil overtake. We're going to fight this battle. All right, now, having said that, we're going to Matthew chapter 5, which I was supposed to do about 10 minutes ago. Yeah, persecution. We'll get there. But Matthew chapter 5, verses 2 through 9, it's interesting to me how Jesus began his teaching. You know, you think about all the things that Jesus could have said when he began his ministry, but he goes up on top of a mountain and he sits down. And his disciples are gathered around, and you know, you think, all right, he's got his first things that he's really going to say. He's going to preach his first powerful sermon. You know, what's he going to say? It's weird to me what he says. In fact, it was weird to the people that heard him say what he said. Will somebody read chapter 7, verses 28 and 29?
Matthew?
Yes.
And so it was when Jesus had ended these sayings that the people were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as the scribes.
Okay, they were astonished what he said. They thought, This is the strangest thing. Because we've been taught if we want to be great, you know what we do? We take it away from other people. If I want to be the head man on the totem pole, you know what I do? I just run over somebody else and push them out of the way. But Jesus said, it says he opened his mouth. All right, now in a Jewish setting, when it says a man that he opened his mouth, this means this is very important. That's there for a reason. Okay, you know, we could read over some things like that if we're not careful. In a Jewish setting, when a Jewish man is reading that and it says that he opened his mouth, like he's speaking from God, is what that means. So it says he opened his mouth, he taught them saying, notice, blessed are the poor in spirit. What does that mean? Literally what Jesus is saying is blessed is a man who empties himself. He empties himself. Now, you and I both know that's not easy to do. But the only way that I can fill my life with the good stuff is to empty myself. And when there's something wrong, I've got to be willing to see it. And I've got to say, you know what? I've got to empty it. That's what Jesus is talking about. It all goes back to humility. So how do we resist the devil? We put ourselves under God, is what he said. We pour ourselves out. We empty ourselves. Now, when I was studying for this, I went back and I looked at all these things that Jesus taught. Every single one of them is connected with humility. Notice what he said. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. What does he mean by that? Does that just mean that God will be with me when I'm sad? I would say that would have something to do with it, but that's not what Jesus is talking about. You make reference to the verse before it. After a man says, I'm wrong, then what does he do? That's right. He gets on his knees and he sheds a tear. That's not easy to do either. Every single one of these is going back to humility. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Meek and humility are like, what's sad to say, what we would call kissing cousins. All right? That's probably a bad term to use there, but they are very close, okay? They are close friends. Blessed are they that hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. That's connected with humility. But blessed are those, he said, who are merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. You know, you can't be merciful without humility. So when I was looking at these, I thought, you know what? All of this is really at the heart of what Jesus taught. How do I resist the devil? I pour myself out. I empty myself before the throne of God. Well, I don't know any other way to describe that than the way that James did and the way that Jesus did as well. There was one little boy, he was sort of rebellious, and the teacher was so tired of him, always causing trouble. And anyway, this was back in the day when you could use a ruler, whip a child. So anyway, she told him to sit down 2 or 3 times. He wouldn't sit down. She came over there and she whacked him on the hand with that ruler and she said, I told you, you better sit down. Well, he sat down and he looked at her and he said, I'm still standing up on the inside. You know, God doesn't do much with people like that. He never has. I think about men in the Bible who really, really did some bad stuff. What about David? I mean, just personally, I could not, in my own life, I couldn't imagine doing some of the stuff he did. And you couldn't either. But that doesn't mean I had never done nothing that's bad. You with me? you think about something about David. He was called a man after God's own heart. And there was a prophet named Nathan that came to him one time and told him a story about a little lamb, a ewe lamb. And he said that this lamb was as unto a daughter to this man. And a rich man came and took the lamb out of the flock, and he prepared it for his friends. David said, he needs to be killed. What did Nathan tell him?
You are a man.
That's you. You took Uriah the Hittite's wife to be your wife. And then you killed him. And he just turned, he turned completely crazy at that point. He wouldn't even get up off the floor. And Nathan said, you need to get up. He said, I can't. Because that's me. I can't get up. But then you have a man who was king before David. Who was that? Saul, right? It's interesting that Saul was told something very similar, but it wasn't, to us in an earthly sense, it wasn't as severe, but to God it was. You see, he offered an offering when he was not allowed to. And Samuel came to Saul, and Saul tried to make the same excuses that David did, and then when he was told, you're the man, he didn't do anything. I didn't even read in the text where Saul even said that he was sorry. So God said, I tell you what, I'm going to take the kingdom from you and I'm going to give it to David. Why was that? It all goes back to one thing. Humility. That's it. There are several themes in the Scriptures that I'm seeing all throughout the Bible. And number one, loving God, of course, loving others, realizing when I'm wrong, being willing to repent, fix the wrong. And number two, helping others get to heaven. Or number four, helping others get to heaven. So there's all similar themes in the Bible. They're all connected with each other. All right, now I want to give you some scriptures here, okay? I'm going to skip over some of this for the sake of time. Now, what I did, I decided to sort of notice a central theme here. Okay, we're talking about one another. All right, and if you go back to James 4, you look at verse 11. This idea is included in here. How do we resist the devil? Okay, he said we submit to God, we draw near to God. But here's another way to resist the devil. Verse 11. Do not speak evil against one another, brothers. For the one who speaks evil against his brother judges his brother, and speaks evil against the law and judges the law. So now I'm going to conclude this section with this idea. How do I treat other people? Now, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. All right, I got 11. All right, so stay with me just for a minute. We got maybe about 12 minutes of class left, but I've looked at some scriptures, and there are more than these, okay? There are more than these, but I've looked at some scriptures that give the idea of one another, okay? James said, don't speak evil against one another. He says this about the body of Christ, that there should be no schism in the body, that is a division. There's no division in the body, but that the members should have the same care, notice, one for another. Galatians 6:2, bear ye one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. And what I did is I just went forward in the New Testament. Like I said, there are more than these. Ephesians 4:32, be ye kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another. You see the central theme in the Bible? The central theme in the Bible is what Jesus began his sermon with. Pour ourselves out and take others in. That's it. Pour ourselves out and take others in. All right, let me give some more. Let's read some of these together. Let's go to Colossians chapter 3, verses 12 and 13. And what we'll do is, Mr. James, will you read Colossians 3, 12 and 13? And Miss Marjorie, will you please read 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 11?
All right, Colossians, what was that?
Colossians 3, 12 and 13.
Colossians 3:12.
Yeah.
Now,
Yes, sir.
therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put one tender mercy, kindness, humility, meekness, and long-suffering, bearing with one another and forgiving one another. If anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ gave you, so also must you do.
Okay. He said, forbearing one another, forgiving one another. All right, 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 11.
Wherefore comfort yourselves together and edify one another, even as also you do.
All right, edify one another. I found these phrases here. I want to share them with you before I move on. I forgot to mention these earlier. One guy, he said, our humility is the one thing that will make us great. It's not about all the other things in the world. Jesus said, if any man is great among you, let him be your servant. Another man, he said this, what can I say about a proud man that he has not already said about himself? It's true. One guy said this, a proud man could learn humility, but then he would be proud of it. I heard a story one time about a guy, the church member, he was given the most humble man of the year award, and they gave him a pin, but then he wouldn't stop wearing it. Well, that reminds me of that phrase there whenever I heard that. It all goes back to humility, all right? So he says, edify one another. I'll give you a few more and then I'll move on. Hebrews 10:24, let us consider one another to provoke unto love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is, but notice, exhorting one another. There's the idea. James 5:16, confess your faults to one another, pray for one another. That's in our book. We're in chapter 4, that's in chapter 5. All right, I'll give you four more. 1 Peter 3:8, be all of one mind, having compassion one of another, love as brethren. Be pitiful and be courteous. Chapter 5, verse 5. Submit yourselves unto the elders, he said, and be subject one to another. So we've seen edify one another, we've seen exhort one another, we've seen love one another, we've seen be courteous to one another, all these one another passages in the Bible. All right, I'll give you two more. We have fellowship one with another. 1 John 1:7. We are to love one another. 1 John 4, verse 7. All right. So, James said, we resist strife. We resist our surroundings. We resist Satan. And we do that by putting ourselves under God. We do that by edifying, loving our brethren. And we move on now to the last part. We resist making a schedule. Now, what do you think that means? I'll be honest with you, I can't live without sticky notes. You know what I mean? I forget a lot of stuff if I... So he's not talking about you and your calendar. You know, I write things on my calendar, stuff like that. Most of us, my wife especially, she cannot live without a calendar. Yes, sir. Yeah, that's right. Sure enough. Somebody said, if you want God to laugh, what do? Make a plan or tell him your plans. That's right. So, you know, it doesn't always turn out the way that we think. Now, I believe what you're saying is literally the key to the last part of James chapter 4. All All right, let's read this quickly and then we'll give a few points and we'll close. We got about 5 minutes. James chapter 4, verse 13, he said, "Come now, ye who say, today or tomorrow we'll go into such a town and we'll spend there a year, we'll trade and make profit. Yet you do not know what the morrow will bring. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little time, then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, to him it is sin." So this idea, it goes back to humility. You know, this guy was arrogant. He even said that he was arrogant. He said, you are boasting in your arrogance. But the question is, how was he boasting in his arrogance? I'll give you 3 ways. See if I can find them here. Here we go. And I've been so guilty of this many times. All of us probably have it sometime or another. But when I was looking at this, I thought, you know what? He's so right. James is so right. He was arrogant because he had self-centered plans. He said, I'm going to go into a city and I'm going to continue there for this certain time. I'm going to buy and sell and get gain. And it's all me, me, me. And I thought to myself, man, you know, that hit me right in the chest. I thought, well, I've done that too. And I wondered why it didn't work the way I wanted it to, because it was about me. This man was arrogant because of self-confident presumption. What if he didn't live for a year? He said, I'm going to go into a city and I'm going to continue there for this amount of time. But God said, you may not even live that long. You don't know. Your life is but a mist. You see, he was just presuming this is what was going to happen. I've been guilty of the same thing. He was complacent. Self-complacent procrastination. You know, at the end he said, if you know to do good and you don't do it, it's a sin. Well, how many of us have been there? Well, I think the man's problem, number one, goes back to what was in the previous part of the chapter. He's not making his plans with the Lord. He's making them without the Lord. It got him into trouble. And ultimately, I think that's what the chapter is about. In fact, he goes into chapter 5 talking about the very same thing. He's gone to just totally pushing God out of the way. You look at chapter 5, verse 1, he said, "Come now, you that rich, you weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotten to you, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion is evidence against you. And it will eat your flesh like fire." You know, he just pushed God out of the way. He said, you know, it's not about what I'm going to do for someone else. This is about what I'm going to do for myself. Well, I've got to be careful about what I'm planning. And I hope that I can remember that in the future. Somebody said this: yesterday is history. Tomorrow is a mystery. Today is a gift from God. That's why they call it the present. I'm going to try my best to make sure to think about that more. So let's challenge ourselves. You know, let's challenge ourselves to have a faith that works. Let's say, you know what? I realize I'm wrong. And I want to resist strife. I want to resist my surroundings. I want to resist Satan. And I want to resist trying to make a schedule that doesn't have God in it. Will you do that with me? Challenge yourself in James chapter 4? All right. You're like, huh? I didn't even hear that. All right, we'll close just a couple minutes early. Thank you so much for your attention today, and we'll continue this study on another time.